Think about a small, wealthy nation tucked away in Southeast Asia, Brunei. It sits on the island of Borneo, surrounded by Malaysia and the vast South China Sea. And, you might not know much about it beyond its oil riches.
It's a fascinating corner of the world, definitely. Little bubble of affluence, you could say,
Yeah.
with a very distinct identity.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we've got excerpts from A Brief History of Brunei.
Our mission, really, is to get under the skin of this nation, to uncover the key historical and cultural forces that have shaped modern Brunei into what it is today. We want to give you a concise, yet thorough understanding, a real shortcut to being well-informed, if you like.
And it's surprising, isn't it? This country, actually smaller than the U.S. state of Delaware, has a history that, well, it punches way above its weight.
Oh, absolutely.
It was once the center of a significant regional power.
Absolutely. And we're about to explore some truly intriguing aspects. We're talking evidence of very early human settlements, the fascinating story of the rise and fall of the Bruneian Empire.
Right. The long-lasting effects of Western colonization, their unique path to independence, how the discovery of oil completely transformed the nation.
Completely changed everything.
Yeah. And the distinctive mix of Malay tradition and Islamic faith that defines its culture. Okay, let's really dig in.
Let's do it. So maybe start by looking at the earliest signs of human presence. The archaeological record, it kind of hints at a long history in this part of Borneo. Now, the well-known Nia and Mulu caves, famous for their ancient human remains, they're actually located in Malaysia now.
Right, I've heard of those.
Yeah, but their close proximity, it strongly suggests that the broader region, including what would have eventually become Brunei, was inhabited way back in ancient times.
Right, so researchers have been looking for direct evidence, like Mesolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age Bruneians. What kind of clues have they actually uncovered in Brunei?
Well, the most direct evidence from early Brunei itself, it consists mainly of pottery sherds and earthenware fragments. They're generally dated to the Neolithic period.
Okay, pottery.
Yeah, and the jar burial discoveries are particularly noteworthy. One was found back in the 1950s near Bukit Pagan, right on the modern border with Malaysia.
Oh, okay.
And another, a larger one, was discovered later near the entrance of Guamulo. So these burial practices, they offer a glimpse, into the rituals of these early inhabitants.
Neolithic jar burials. What does that really tell us about their society? Is it about status or beliefs?
Well, it suggests certain beliefs about the afterlife, or at least the proper treatment of the deceased. The size and nature of the jars could indicate social status, or maybe specific burial customs. It's hard to say for sure.
Right.
Moving forward in time, the prevailing theory suggests that speakers of Malaic and other Austronesian languages likely migrated to the Brunei area during the Chalcolithic period.
That's the transition between Neolithic and Bronze Age.
Exactly, a transitional time. And archaeological work has aimed to trace these population movements. Then, in the Iron Age, we find numerous earthenware and metal artifacts linked to the emergence of a state known as Krong Bruni.
Krong?
Yeah. And interestingly, these findings also point to their significant involvement in piracy, which was pretty prevalent in the South China Sea back then.
South China Sea piracy, maybe not the most glamorous origin story, but it certainly highlights the maritime focus of these early communities, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It underscores how central the sea was.
So what was the bigger picture? What was this region like before Brunei really rose to prominence?
Well, before the 8th century, several other smaller maritime states existed in the Brunei area. And before Islam arrived, and before the subsequent sort of Indianization, Buddhism was likely the dominant religious influence. You have to remember, for many early civilizations, seas and rivers were the highways, the primary routes for settlement and trade.
Makes sense.
And Brunei was no different. Most early communities clustered right along these waterways, which is actually a contrast with other migration patterns, like, say, the Australian Aborigines, who primarily followed land routes.
So these early Bruneians were skilled seafarers then. What kind of boats are we talking about?
Evidence suggests they likely used oar-driven boats, probably constructed with planks. And over time, we see the development of larger settlements specifically dedicated to building these impressive armed war canoes.
War canoes, wow.
Yeah, they weren't just for getting around. They were crucial for those raiding activities we mentioned, for the piracy.
Right, those early coastal states involved in piracy. It paints a picture of a dynamic, maybe somewhat turbulent region before a more unified power took hold.
Definitely.
Now, this is where the story really takes off, isn't it? The rise of the Bruneian Empire.
Indeed. Present-day Brunei was once the central part of a much, much larger kingdom that really solidified in the early 14th century. And interestingly, the entire island was often just referred to as Borneo back then.
And this period marks a huge cultural and religious shift, right? The arrival of Islam.
Precisely. Brunei is specifically mentioned in historical accounts related to the spread of Islam in the 14th century. We even have records of a Bruneian Raja sending tribute to the Chinese emperor in 1368.
Okay, so it was on the radar internationally.
At least in the eyes of the Chinese imperial court, yeah. Sending tribute was a common practice, for smaller kingdoms to acknowledge China's power and, importantly, secure trade relationships.
But it wasn't just a straight line upwards, was it? I remember the sources mentioning a period of decline.
That's right. Around the turn of the 15th century, Brunei went through a period of internal instability. There was conflict between those who'd converted to Islam and those who hadn't. It actually led to civil war. Now, there was a temporary recovery, but it was really in the 15th century that the Sultanate truly reached the height of its power and influence.
Okay, so at its peak, how extensive was this empire? Where did it reach?
Oh, it stretched far into Borneo and the southern Philippines. Bruneian rulers held authority over significant ports like Pontianak and Kuching and pretty much the entire east coast of Borneo.
Wow.
Now, this era isn't actually that well documented by outsiders, which adds to its somewhat legendary status.
Right.
But the information we do have depicts a pretty elegant Islamic monarchy with considerable regional clout.
Elegant and powerful. And the founding of the Sultanate itself, it has some fascinating connections to wider regional events, doesn't it?
It does. The Sultanate, as we kind of understand it today, was established in the 14th century. That was around the time the Muslim Malikans were gaining power and influence,
Okay.
which led to the displacement of the Majapahit kingdom from Java, a huge power shift in the region. So this new Sultanate of Brunei, it encompassed a significant territory. We're talking much of what is now Sarawak, Sabah, and Palawan.
That's a big area.
It is. And the Bruneian rulers, they claimed a lineage tracing back to early Islamic Rajas in the region, some of the first to adopt Islam. And they even asserted this rather grand ancestral link, claiming descent from the sun as the ancient Maharajas of Borneo.
Descent from the sun, quite a statement. What were the key factors, then, that propelled Brunei to such prominence as a trading kingdom?
Well, the growth of trade in valuable resources like tin and gold in the 17th century, that was a major factor. Brunei became this proud, independent Muslim state, a notable center for Islamic scholarship and culture. Religious scholars of the Quran played a vital role, bringing literacy and Islamic teachings to the indigenous populations of Borneo. This period also saw the construction of stone mosques and a real flourishing of local craftsmanship, producing beautiful, intricate artifacts.
So by the 15th century, Brunei was the central power in the Islamic sphere of Borneo, covering, 327,000 square kilometers? That's huge. What kind of power did the Sultan wield then?
Immense power. The Sultan functioned as both a supreme political and religious leader. Now, this era is largely known through oral traditions and legends, as, like I said, detailed archaeological evidence is a bit scarce.
Okay.
However, the widespread adoption of Islam did trigger some significant interactions with the wider world.
Such as that visit from the Chinese emperor's tribute expedition in 1408, that seems like a really significant event in their history.
Absolutely. That marked the first recorded foreign visit to Brunei and really put it firmly on the map in Chinese records, where charmingly it was referred to as the land of hopping deer.
Hopping deer.
Yeah, a reference to the island's native deer species.
Huh.
And Arab records from the same period also support Brunei's status as this large, influential Muslim kingdom. The Sultan's authority extending across modern-day Brunei, Djibouti in Sarawak, and the southern Philippines.
So around the 16th century, the Bruneian Empire was really at its height. Influence along the coast of Sarawak, authority recognized, down to Palawan. But surely not everyone within this vast territory was happy with Bruneian rule.
No, definitely not. The indigenous populations, particularly groups like the Dayaks, they put up strong resistance to Brunei's powerful military and naval forces.
Right.
They were largely kept under control, though, until the arrival of the Portuguese, who, under the guise of missionary work and trade, tried to expand their own influence in the region.
Ah, the European powers arrived.
Exactly. And this European intrusion was a major concern for the Muslim Bruneians. They were also increasingly wary of the growing power of Spain over in the Philippines, which actually prompted them to consolidate their control over eastern Borneo, trying to limit further European expansion in the area.
And then you have figures like Sultan Bolkiah. His reign sounds particularly important in shaping the empire.
Indeed. Sultan Bolkiah reigned from 1485 to either 1524 or 1525. He was the fifth sultan and a remarkable figure. His extensive military conquests earned him the title the Conqueror in some accounts.
The Conqueror.
Yeah, and he was even known as the Majesty of 1,000 Islands because his domain was so vast. Under his rule, Brunei's territories reached their greatest extent. Present-day Sabah, southern Sarawak, parts of Kalimantan in Indonesia, and Mindanao in the Philippines.
Wow.
He's remembered as one of Brunei's most powerful and influential rulers, and he's also credited with further promoting the spread of Islam throughout Brunei and Southeast Asia.
It all seems to come back to Brunei's strategic location, doesn't it? Along the Malacca Straits, that vital trade route. It's fascinating to think it began as this small settlement maybe 6,000 years ago and evolved into this significant 14th century empire, Empire Brunei, a thriving trade hub that embraced Islam.
A huge transformation.
But as we know, empires rise and fall. Let's delve into the factors that led to its decline and the increasing influence of colonial powers.
Right, so the arrival of the Spanish and the Portuguese in the 16th century, that really marked a significant turning point. Their intense rivalry, vying to control the lucrative trade routes between China and West Asia, it created considerable disruption in the region, and ultimately it contributed to the gradual weakening of the Bruneian Empire. But it wasn't solely external pressure.
Okay.
Internal factors like anti-imperial sentiments within conquered territories, natural disasters, even outbreaks of plague, they also played a role in Brunei's decline.
It sounds like Brunei's experience with European powers was quite different compared to other Malay states, perhaps. Why was that?
Well, while the European presence didn't maybe have as immediate and drastic an impact on some other Malay states initially, Brunei definitely witnessed a significant reduction in its territory and its overall influence. By the time the British protectorate was established, Brunei was often described as, well, a tinier shadow of its former self. Even the local administration had undergone changes. Sharia law was largely replaced in some areas by district systems based on Malay customs. But it's important to note, Islam had by this point become deeply embedded in Brunei's social and cultural fabric.
And its status as a tributary state to various powers, sometimes entities in what's now Malaysia, that also contributed to its vulnerability, it seems.
Yes, absolutely. That tributary status further eroded Brunei's standing and control over its former territories. These territories were often divided up among other emerging states. Some came under direct British administration, others were loosely controlled by Brunei or local leaders. Brunei's position as a dependent state just made it increasingly vulnerable. And the socioeconomic gaps that developed between Brunei and these other regions also fueled resentment. For Brunei itself, unless its status as a separate sovereign entity was firmly recognized, the risk of being completely absorbed was a real one.
The succession of the early sultans and their leadership must have also played a crucial role during this period of transition.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
You have the story of Awang Alak-Betatar's conversion to Islam around 1400. He took the Islamic name Sultan Muhammad and ruled over Brunei, Puni, and Mambang.
Okay.
His successors, including his son, also named Sultan Muhammad, then Sultan Hassan, and Sultan Ahmad, who's considered the sixth and last of Brunei's early Islamic rulers, they continued to expand the territory.
Right.
Sultan Hassan, in particular, he ascended to the throne at a young age and relied heavily on this really capable figure, Pangeran Seri Maharaja, a brilliant administrator and military strategist. He implemented vital defensive measures, like diverting the river to protect the capital and fortifying its mouth.
Smart moves.
Yeah. And Sultan Ahmad's reign is often remembered as a kind of golden age for Brunei,
Yeah.
marked by the construction of defensive forts on various islands within his domain.
But the arrival of European powers ultimately changed Brunei's destiny, irrevocably.
Indeed. The British entry into Borneo via the Baru River, in what's now Indonesia, that opened a whole new chapter. We start to see the establishment of pineapple plantations and an increase in trade facilitated by the British.
Okay.
However, internally, Sultan Ahmad's rule in the 19th century was marked by growing instability. There were issues of perceived incompetence among some officials and increasing tribal dissensions within the Sultanate's remaining territories.
And then we have Sultan Omar Ali Safuddin II, who tried to push back against these encroaching influences.
He did. He undertook significant efforts to revitalize the state and secure its long-term independence. However, his attempts to negotiate with the British, maybe with the intention of safeguarding Brunei's interests, ultimately led to what the source describes as a disastrous treaty. Despite receiving the title of Sir from the British, This agreement effectively placed Brunei under the control of a British resident until the Japanese occupation during World War II.
Right.
Sultan Muhammad Jamal al-Alam later succeeded him.
Which leads us directly to the formal establishment of the British Protectorate in 1888. What were the key motivations for Sultan Hashim to actually seek British protection? It seems counterintuitive.
Well, Sultan Hashim's primary belief, it seems, was that entering into a treaty of protection with Great Britain would prevent any further territorial losses or interference from other European powers, like Spain, perhaps.
Okay.
The prevailing colonial discourse often presented imperialism as this benevolent force, Britain claiming a desire to establish law and order following an internal political crisis in 1885.
Right, the civilizing mission idea.
Exactly. Sultan Hashim and his advisors even attempted to leverage the existing rivalry between Britain and Spain to their advantage. But apparently, a misinformed belief that a British military intervention was imminent ultimately led Sultan Hashim to voluntarily request British protection.
So what were the crucial terms of that 1888 treaty? What did it actually say?
Essentially, it had three main points. Britain agreed to handle Brunei's defense in case of an external attack. The British were granted the right to appoint a resident to advise the Sultan on governance matters. And thirdly, Brunei was supposed to remain autonomous in its own internal laws, although Britain retained the right to oversee important legal cases.
But it wasn't enough to stop further encroachment.
No. Despite these conditions, the treaty ultimately proved insufficient to prevent further colonial encroachment and the gradual erosion of Brunei's sovereignty.
It sounds like the British gradually tightened their grip anyway, despite the initial terms.
They did. While Sultan Hashim initially kept a degree of internal authority, the position of High Commissioner, a more powerful figure than the resident, remained unfilled for 7 years after the 1890 agreement. The arrival of Sir William Hood Treacher in 1897 marked a significant shift.
Okay.
It really signified the full imposition of British power and the beginning of the systematic dismemberment of Brunei's remaining territory. Indigenous customs were increasingly disregarded, replaced by imported British laws. Brunei's own currency was phased out, replaced by Malayan coins. And new business licenses with fees and regulations unfamiliar to local traders were introduced. Even a commissioner's fine was established, with the revenue often benefiting the local British administrators.
It's a familiar pattern, isn't it? Colonial powers asserting authority, restructuring local systems for their own benefit. What about Sultan Muhammad Jamal al-Aziz? Did he try to resist this?
Yes. Sultan Muhammad Jamal al-Aziz, who reigned from 1885 to 1906, he did make efforts. He tried to bolster the state's finances through taxation and modernize Brunei's administrative structures, attempting to counter this increasing threat of European imperialism.
Right.
He even voiced objections to developing telegraph lines in the Malay states and implementing new commercial regulations, actions that, ironically, probably drew even closer scrutiny and interest from the British.
So the British imperial interest wasn't just political control, economic opportunities, resource exploitation. That was clearly significant too.
Oh, absolutely. British individuals had visited Brunei as early as 1880 to explore its natural resources, particularly the potential for establishing rubber plantations, given its proximity to existing irrigation projects in the region. There was this growing sentiment among some, both within Brunei and British circles, that greater British involvement could help Brunei overcome its internal challenges, achieve some stability.
Right.
While Sultan Muhammad himself was wary of treaty-making and the expanding British presence, his political position was increasingly weak. Accepting even seemingly limited safeguards ultimately paved the way for the permanent presence of a British officer. And gradually, British advice became mandatory across various aspects of governance, eventually leading to their control over key sectors like commercial banking and communication companies.
The history of Brunei's governance during this long period, it seems to have gone through several distinct phases shaped by different internal and external pressures.
Indeed. The source outlines 3 main periods. The first, roughly 316 AD to 1400 AD, saw Brunei evolve into an Islamic Malay Sultanate and an important regional trading port.
Okay.
The second, 1400 to 1521 AD, marks Brunei's peak, its zenith as a powerful trading empire with significant international connections.
Right.
And the third phase continues until the reign of Sultan Muhammad, characterized by these increasing external pressures from European colonial powers.
And there were key religious and cultural figures who played a big role in shaping Brunei's early Islamic identity, weren't there?
Yes, absolutely. The arrival of Sayyidina Sharif Ali, a respected merchant and missionary from Ta'if in Arabia, that was a pivotal moment. He married Sultan Ahmad's daughter and eventually became his successor, ruling from 1425 to 1432 AD. He really solidified Islamic rule and introduced important religious practices. And earlier, around 1318 AD, Mahkota, the ruler of Tanjung Pagar, visited Brunei, which helped facilitate the arrival of West Asian merchants and the early spread of Islamic influence. Raja Kamru, the ruler of Temasek, ancient Singapore, also visited with his sons, bringing valuable armor and other goods, highlighting Brunei's early connections within the Malay archipelago.
It's a fascinating tapestry: local leadership, foreign influences, the gradual consolidation of power under the Sultanate. Now let's jump forward quite a bit to a period of immense global upheaval: World War II and the subsequent Japanese occupation of Brunei.
Right, a huge shift. The increasing tensions in the Asia-Pacific region culminated, of course, in Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Within hours, coordinated attacks on Allied military bases followed, and the crucial British naval base at Singapore fell in February 1942. The Imperial Japanese forces then swiftly invaded and occupied vast territories across Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, parts of India, various isolated British possessions.
And Brunei itself wasn't immune. What was its strategic importance for the Japanese war effort? Why Brunei?
Oil. The oil reserves located in Brunei Bay held vital strategic importance to the Japanese war machine, particularly for fueling their heavy bombers and transport aircraft. So following naval battles in the South China Sea, Brunei was swiftly brought under Japanese military occupation in December 1941.
Life under Japanese occupation must have been incredibly harsh for the Bruneian people.
Indeed. Very similar to other territories occupied by the Japanese, Brunei experienced significant hardship, intense militarization, and the systematic exploitation of its people and natural resources to support the Japanese war effort.
Right.
And as the tide of the war turned against Japan, the situation in Brunei got even worse. Allied air raids targeted the oil fields, provoking retaliatory actions by the Japanese forces in Borneo, causing widespread destruction and suffering.
The defeat of Japan in 1945 brought an end to the occupation, but the process of recovery and rebuilding must have been a monumental task.
Oh, absolutely. It was a period of immense challenges. The Japanese defeats led to the devastation of local industries and severely hampered any immediate recovery efforts. The oil fields were briefly brought back under Japanese control in 1945, just before their final surrender. Martial law had been declared in Brunei back in July 1944. Placing all aspects of life under strict military control. Growing poverty led to widespread food shortages, famine, disease. While peace returned in mid-1945 and some initial consultations did happen between the returning British authorities and Bruneian representatives, Brunei remained largely isolated for several years, and fundamental economic reforms were largely put on hold.
The war seems to have had a profound, lasting impact on Brunei society and its future path.
Definitely. By the late 1950s, Brunei society showed this distinct stratification. You had emerging groups of intellectuals and a middle-class elite alongside the traditional structures, villagers, royalty, nobles. There was also a noticeable trend towards urbanization, as people migrated from rural areas seeking new opportunities. The period from the late 50s to 1970 saw a significant socioeconomic and educational development, still under British influence, marked by the establishment of various government departments and initiatives. The British administration even took direct control of the education system in preparation for the eventual transfer of power, modernizing the examination system.
And then came the eventual achievement of full independence in 1984. But the path leading up to that wasn't entirely smooth, was it?
No, not at all. While independence brought about a process of localization across various sectors, it also presented new challenges. Things like issues related to the large-scale immigration of foreign labor, which wasn't always well coordinated.
Right.
Brunei also became heavily reliant on its significant oil wealth, making it susceptible to the inherent volatility of global oil markets.
Yeah.
The iron law of demand and supply, and the long-term prospect of dwindling reserves.
Yeah, that's a common issue.
Exactly. The government's policy of providing generous subsidies and high salaries while contributing to a high standard of living also fostered a degree of overconsumption and economic dependency. Meanwhile, Brunei's strong adherence to Southeast Asian values, focus on tradition, acceptance of fate to some degree, the central importance of family and community, deeply ingrained social obligations continued to shape its societal norms. Despite the close-knit nature of Bruneian communities, the underlying social contract remained somewhat rigid, with potential social and cultural repercussions for those who transgressed established norms.
The immediate post-war transition, going from Japanese back to British administration, must have been a period of significant disruption and uncertainty.
Oh, completely chaotic. Brunei, like many other liberated regions in Southeast Asia, faced immense problems right after the war. The British government initially planned to reestablish direct military rule and dispatched reconnaissance teams to assess the damage and the existing administrative capacity. The first British team arrived in November 1945, marking the formal reestablishment of British administration. But a significant challenge was the lack of an effective administrative apparatus. Many pre-war civil servants had defected or been exiled.
And the British approach to governing in this post-war period seems to have had lasting implications for Brunei's development.
It did. The British administration's approach is often characterized as a relatively swift return to the pre-war status quo. The Sultan retained significant power, and there was somewhat limited direct British intervention in certain internal affairs compared to before.
Right.
Notably, Britain made a policy decision to largely withdraw from active involvement in increasingly important areas like education, healthcare, law, and fostering public participation in governance.
Interesting. Why?
Well, it meant a departure from earlier modernization programs, leaving behind a legal system heavily reliant on colonial-era legislation. However, there was this prevailing sense of optimism, particularly among the Bruneian elite, that Brunei's inherent independence remained largely intact. Perhaps because before the major oil discoveries in 1929, Brunei didn't appear to hold significant long-term strategic or economic value for Britain.
That sets the stage perfectly for the emergence of a more organized independence movement. It wasn't just a sudden thing, was it?
No. The initial seeds of a nationalist movement began to appear in early 20th century Brunei, fueled by a growing awareness of political and economic inequalities and a desire for greater self-determination. The Brunei Malay League was founded in 1950 with the primary aim of educating the broader public about their political rights, fostering a sense of national identity. Later, in 1956, the Brunei People's Party was established. This party advocated for stronger anti-colonial principles and a significant revision of the existing constitution. They explicitly sought full independence and self-government, while also criticizing the perceived ineffectiveness of the British-controlled State Council.
Were there key figures leading this?
Yes, key figures who emerged included the journalist Yusuf Muhammad and the politician Abdurrahman bin Muhammad Yassin.
In these early movements, they actively sought to voice their demands for more autonomy, eventual independence.
They did. In 1951, the Brunei Malay League presented a formal petition to the British resident, specifically calling for more Bruneians on the State Council, the key advisory body.
Right.
Following clashes between students and teachers in 1957, the British resident did implement some limited modifications to the Constitution. Then in 1958, a second, more assertive petition was submitted, explicitly stating Brunei's desire for complete and immediate independence. Some anonymous sources even claimed the protectorate had never truly been accepted by the Bruneian people. The Brunei Malay League also rejected proposed future election procedures, reflecting a growing distrust of the existing political framework. Popular sentiment among some segments of society began to shift away from the traditional ruling classes. There was a growing belief that a more direct, maybe even forceful approach, inspired by successful independence movements elsewhere, might be necessary.
But they didn't publicly advocate violence.
No. Key figures within the movement publicly denied any intention of staging a coup, emphasizing their commitment to a peaceful constitutional struggle.
But that path to independence ultimately involved a significant episode of unrest, the 1962 uprising.
Tragically, yes. Armed violence did erupt on December 8, 1962. A grenade exploded at the Sultan's palace, coinciding with a radio broadcast effectively banning the planned uprising. The Brunei People's Party used the radio to broadcast their demand for immediate independence. While localized acts of violence and unrest did spread in certain areas, the uprising ultimately failed to gain widespread popular support or significant momentum. The British responded swiftly, deploying aircraft. Ground fighting continued for about 10 days. This event became known as the Affair of Brunei.
Right.
In response, Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin declared a state of emergency, which led to the intervention and occupation of Brunei by British military forces roughly 6 weeks after the initial outbreak.
It's a stark reminder of the complexities, sometimes the violence, of decolonization. Brunei's eventual path to sovereignty seems somewhat unique compared to some neighbors, though.
It is. Unlike many other nations that formally ceded their sovereignty through treaties during colonization, Brunei's sovereignty was never fully surrendered in that specific legal sense. Becoming a British protected state was a distinct path. Nevertheless, the desire for greater control over their own political destiny intensified throughout the 1950s. Bruneians increasingly questioned British influence over their natural resources and political affairs. This growing movement manifested in various forms: peaceful protests, civil unrest, participation in contested elections. Nationalism emerged as a unifying force, bringing together diverse ethnic and political groups under the common goal of achieving full sovereignty.
Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin III's reign seems particularly pivotal, coinciding with huge social and political changes both in Brunei and across the wider decolonization landscape.
Yes, absolutely. His ascension occurred during a time of considerable social transformation and the rise of independence movements globally, which undoubtedly fueled nationalist and reformist pressures within Brunei too. The idea of a deliberative assembly representing the people's interests was discussed in Brunei as early as the 1940s. However, the Sultan actively maintained Brunei's system of absolute monarchy. Furthermore, British control over the lucrative Brunei Shell Petroleum Company and the somewhat opaque distribution of oil wealth through indirect dividends and royal funds, well, it inadvertently served to dampen overt expressions of nationalist sentiment among some segments of the population.
And internal social dynamics, particularly around education and religion, also played a significant role in shaping the path to independence, didn't they?
Oh, definitely. The emphasis on communalism within the education system and religious institutions inadvertently hindered the development of a unified, politically homogeneous society. Unequal access to decision-making and resources along ethnic and religious lines further entrenched existing divisions. Individuals critical of the Sultan's policies or advocating for significant political reforms often found themselves excluded from his inner circles. The proliferation of various communal socio-religious organizations, while serving important social functions, also tended to confine political mobilization along these pre-existing ethnic and religious lines.
So, looking at the key events that ultimately led to Brunei's independence in 1984, we see this complex interplay of internal pressures and external influences.
We do. The brief, tragic reign of Abdul Rahman in 1934, followed by the Regency Council declaring Princess Noor as Sultan, was quickly superseded by the British, recalling Abdul Rahman's brother, Omar Ali Saifuddin, from labor camps to take the throne.
Right.
Then, the profound impact of World War II. Japan's bombing and occupation deeply affected the Sultan and the people. In the aftermath, Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin III founded the Brunei Malay Union in 1947, driven by his wartime experiences and a growing awareness of the need for greater political and economic self-determination.
Okay.
This period also saw multiple political parties and labor unions emerge, including the Brunei Society, actively campaigning for independence under UN auspices and a democratic government. The Brunei People's Party, founded in 1953, tried negotiating with Britain, but that ultimately failed. Despite the opposition gaining ground in the 1959 elections, the 1962 rebellion and its forceful suppression by British forces' widespread raids, arrests effectively crushed immediate hopes for independence and led to that prolonged state of emergency. With the main political party Britain might have worked with largely dismantled, the focus shifted towards a more direct appeal to the Sultan himself to push for independence from British protection.
That brings us to Brunei's modern era, a period largely defined by its significant oil wealth and its impact on the nation's development.
Yes, the late 20th century witnessed a dramatic transformation. From a relatively small port, a less influential part of the Malay Sultanates, the discovery of substantial oil fields in 1929 propelled Brunei into the ranks of the world's wealthiest nations. Initial geological surveys identified promising potential. Drilling started in 1932 and soon revealed some of the richest oil deposits globally. The establishment of Brunei Shell Petroleum Company, with significant royalty payments flowing to the Sultan and the state, coupled with the dramatic increase in oil production after WWII, fundamentally reshaped Brunei's economy and society.
This immense oil wealth must have had a profound, wide-ranging impact on public life, the overall standard of living.
Well, it certainly did. The substantial oil royalties transformed public expenditure, enabled massive investments in healthcare, education, urban infrastructure, leading to a remarkable improvement in the overall standard of living, comparable to some developed nations in North America and Europe.
Wow.
Consumer goods became readily available, affordable for a large segment of the population. Interestingly, despite the significant political changes and rise of nationalist movements nearby during this time, Ethnically motivated discontent remained relatively limited in Brunei until the 1960s.
But politically, Brunei continued to operate under a largely top-down system of governance, didn't it?
Yes, Brunei has continued to be governed with the Sultan wielding ultimate absolute power. Despite occasional calls for greater political reform from certain segments of society, the overall political landscape remains relatively insular. There's generally limited desire for widespread public participation in formal political processes.
Right.
The government has responded to some social and cultural shifts by increasing its emphasis on moral education rooted in Islamic principles and more rigorous religious teaching in the national curriculum. The Brunei Economic Development Board has been actively formulating strategies, implementing initiatives aimed at diversifying the economy away from oil and gas,
Crucial.
and investing in human capital for a more sustainable future. Brunei has also made efforts to foster stronger international relations. However, it's likely that the long-reigning sultan and the inner circles of power remain cautious about any significant challenges to the existing political and social order.
Brunei's economic development story is truly remarkable. The source highlights it as the first Southeast Asian country to achieve widespread prosperity, mainly through oil discovery in 1929.
It is a significant case study, how managing natural resource wealth can be leveraged for national development. Although, as we've discussed, this path isn't without its own unique long-term challenges and potential dependencies. While earlier exploration attempts in the 1890s failed, the eventual discovery of commercially viable oil wells after nearly 2 decades of effort marked that crucial turning point. The Brunei oil field, starting production after WWII in 1947, ushered in an era of rapidly increasing government revenues, which in turn funded significant infrastructure projects and comprehensive administrative reforms. Brunei achieved remarkable progress in education, public health, housing, social welfare, and initial efforts towards economic diversification.
The economic boom starting in the 1970s, fueled by global oil price increases, must have been extraordinary, propelling Brunei among the wealthiest Islamic states globally.
Indeed. The substantial surge in crude oil revenue since the 70s propelled Brunei to significant affluence. However, the finite nature of oil and gas reserves, with projected lifespans, well, it's underscored the critical need for proactive economic diversification. Right. Which the government has increasingly emphasized through attracting foreign investments in sectors like light manufacturing, services, tourism, including ambitious initiatives like the Sagara High-Tech Park.
Looking at the political framework of modern Brunei, the foundational role of Islam under the early Sultan Muhammad Shah is clearly a significant, enduring legacy.
Absolutely. His deep faith in Islam not only established the fundamental spiritual identity of Brunei, but also provided a crucial framework for its early political and social organization. While colonial powers significantly eroded the Sultan's direct political authority over time, the institution of the Sultanate and its central religious significance remained.
Right.
Treaties like the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824 and the British Protection Treaty of 1888 further defined and limited the Sultan's temporal powers externally. The designation as a quasi-protectorate in 1906 saw the Sultan retain direct control over political succession and Islamic religious affairs, while a British resident oversaw general administration.
The enactment of the 1959 Constitution appears to have been a key step towards a more formalized structure of governance.
It was. The 1959 Constitution included provisions for a legislative council, albeit with limited powers, and the creation of various public local bodies. The enforcement of security and local government ordinances led to the formal division of Brunei into 4 administrative areas.
Okay.
The 1984 Brunei United Kingdom Treaty Agreement finally reaffirmed Brunei's full independence. However, the Constitution continues to enshrine significant prerogatives for the monarch, and the Sultan ultimately retains sole legislative authority.
Right.
There have been some criticisms regarding the effectiveness of public sector growth initiatives and a perceived lack of public consultation in allocating state funds under the 1984 framework, as well as expressions of social disenchantment concerning a part system within government and ineffective public complaints mechanisms, which has frustrated some expectations for a more participatory system.
Turning our attention to Brunei's rich cultural heritage, it's evident that Malay traditions and the Islamic faith are deeply, inextricably linked.
Brunei's culture is indeed profoundly rooted in Malay traditions and customs, which have been significantly enriched and shaped by the pervasive influence of Islam. While the majority adhere to Islam, they continue to actively preserve and practice local customs, many with historical origins in the Sampan Buri, the maritime Malay Empire. The spread of Islam also spurred greater interest in literary pursuits and artistic expression, seen in the reverence for classic Malay works like the Sejarah Melayu and Hikayat Kota Batu. Traditional Bruneian dances like the Adai or Nakelka, beautifully depicting fishing, vividly showcase this heritage. Despite increasing Western influences, adherence to these local customs remains strong.
And Islam in Brunei isn't just personal faith, it's deeply integrated into the nation's governance and legal system.
Absolutely. Brunei is officially a Muslim nation governed by a system integrating theocratic principles. Islam isn't merely personal belief, but an integral part of daily life. Citizens are expected to observe the 5 daily prayers.
Yeah.
The Sultan himself holds the position of head of Islam. Brunei operates under a unique legal framework, with both a secular constitution and a parallel system of Islamic law established by royal decree. Rather than strict separation of church and state, Brunei views Islam as a comprehensive way of life, encompassing secular and religious aspects.
You have both systems running side by side.
Exactly. A Western-style parliament, though mainly advisory, and established Sharia courts dealing with specific legal matters for Muslims. Bruneians generally see their religion, customs, and heritage as inseparable, interconnected pillars of their national identity. This framework contributes to a society often characterized as progressive, yet cautious of extremes, enlightened, and known for a general sense of benevolent ease. There's a strong societal expectation that these core elements will endure against ongoing influences of Western education and global culture.
Brunei's cultural identity, then, is this fascinating, distinctive blend of influences.
It truly is, marked by interwoven threads of Malay traditions, Islamic faith, and aspects of modernity. While sharing traits with Southeast Asian neighbors, Brunei's strong Islamic convictions and enduring royal heritage create a uniquely distinctive atmosphere. It permeates daily life, social etiquette, community interactions, clothing, art, cuisine.
You mentioned adat earlier.
Yes, time-honored customary practices, collectively known as adat, guide social behavior, based on traditions, religions, social status, and a belief in consequences. Various forms govern different aspects. Adat Keluarga for family matters, Adat Prapati for land and property, Adat Istiadat for ceremonies and formal occasions. Numerous other traditions like Malam Munajat, nights of prayer, celebrations for the Sultan's and Agong's birthdays, Maulud Nabi, Prophet's birthday, Hari Raya, Eid festivals, beautifully blend Islamic tenets with Malay cultural practices. Brunei also has traditional games, some shared with wider Malay culture, but they face some decline as youth favor modern entertainment. Cultural centers like the Home of Harmony play an important role in preserving and showcasing arts and traditions, including games like Tumbuk Nasi, Bulu Ayam, Gala Panjang.
And at the very core of this identity, Islam remains the central defining element.
Absolutely. Islam serves as the fundamental core of Brunei's ethnicity, culture, traditions, politics, guiding daily life based on the Al-Quran and Sunnah. Islam holds the highest position in the Constitution, explicitly recognized as the guiding principle. Islamic concepts are deeply imbued in virtually all facets of Bruneian culture. The Islamic Religious Council assists the Sultan on all matters related to Islam and legislation, including appointments and approving religious laws. Its office administers religious affairs through 3 branches: religious teaching, development of religious officers, and state affairs related to Islam. There's also a respected religious council, or ulama council, of prominent religious leaders providing guidance.
How did pre-Islamic customs fit in?
Many were adapted over time to align with Islamic teachings. Contradictory customs were either prohibited or significantly transformed. A good example is the cultural practices around breaking the fast during Ramadan. The deep, beautiful integration of Islamic teachings into cultural practices is a defining characteristic. Islam's influence extends beyond personal faith to shape public policy, individual conduct, all aspects of Brunei's unique customs. During the proclamation of independence, the Sultan emphasized Brunei's identity as an Islamic state for the Muslims and of the Muslims, explicitly linking peace and prosperity to adherence to Islamic principles. Brunei's independence was seen as intrinsically tied to the freedom to live according to Islamic principles.
Shifting focus to Brunei's engagement with the wider world, it's been an active participant regionally and internationally, especially since independence.
Yes, Brunei joined ASEAN in January 1984, just a month after full independence. By the late 1990s, it had developed into a respected, credible regional leader within the organization. Brunei's initial caution towards ASEAN expansion evolved to be more accommodating, recognizing the value of broader political influence.
Right.
Brunei has initiated several successful forums on economic and industrial cooperation and the ASEAN Free Trade Area, Notably, Brunei hosted the ASEAN Exposition in 1993. It's also broadened its membership in various external multilateral organizations focused on regional cooperation.
Any specific diplomatic achievements?
Well, one significant effort was successfully encouraging greater engagement between China and ASEAN, viewing it as a positive step towards reducing potential conflicts in the South China Sea. While Brunei has provided some military and developmental assistance, like medical clinics, the annual ASEAN summits haven't always translated into tangible, large-scale impacts on the ground.
Maintaining strong relationships with immediate neighbors, particularly Malaysia and Indonesia, seems like a high priority for Brunei's foreign policy.
Oh, paramount. Historical maps and diplomatic records show Brunei's long-standing desire for clear, formalized borders with both Malaysia and Indonesia, aiming to transform potential disputes into predictable, mutually agreed-upon boundaries, reducing future contentions.
Right.
While Brunei has largely achieved clearer border demarcations, it initially came at some cost to broader foreign relations, with periods of tension with Malaysia and Indonesia in the early years post-independence. Negotiations with Malaysia in 1986 resulted in a boundary agreement, though its full implementation has faced some delays.
Brunei's commitment to the ASEAN framework appears key to its foreign policy strategy.
Yes, ASEAN was founded on the belief in regional cooperation for long-term security, stability, and prosperity. While primary loyalty is naturally to member states, the inclusion of Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam created a truly pan-Southeast Asian organization.
But that expansion brought challenges.
It did. Newer members needed to adjust to ASEAN norms, and the organization faced criticism regarding its non-interference policy, especially concerning Myanmar. ASEAN's future relevance is debated, particularly with ongoing internal issues in some newer members and Indonesia. Many suggest ASEAN could strengthen relevance by pushing for greater internal cohesion through a clear common vision and enhanced institutions. But past efforts to articulate this vision seriously have often fallen short. Ultimately, a clear rationale for ASEAN's existence and active member engagement is crucial for its future relevance, to prevent calls for dismantling or reorganization.
What about Brunei's specific bilateral relationships with Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines?
Generally, cordial and stable relations with Malaysia and Singapore, based on mutual respect for sovereignty. Occasional disagreements arise, like ongoing talks on land boundary demarcation with Sarawak and Brunei's claim to a special economic zone. Negotiations happen through established channels.
Okay.
Brunei is active in the Malaysia-Brunei Joint Commission, discussing mutual interests like economic and trade cooperation. They have a joint trade committee, and Brunei promotes trade through visits and seminars. Leaders have committed to intensifying cooperation. With the Philippines, relations are friendly, but differences exist on maritime boundary delineation in the South China Sea. Bilateral meetings occur, and Brunei emphasizes peaceful settlement through dialogue under UNCLOS. This is pursued within their Joint Commission on Bilateral Cooperation.
And its relationship with its other major neighbor, Indonesia.
Generally good relations. But a long-standing difference over the maritime boundary in the South China Sea persists, occasionally leading to fishing boat incidents. Efforts within ASEAN aim for cooperation in regulating high seas fishing. Importantly, Indonesia agreed to establish meetings between Border Patrol forces to discuss and manage this constructively.
Shifting focus again, let's discuss the environmental challenges Brunei faces alongside its development.
Right. Brunei, like many rapidly developing nations, faces environmental challenges: air and water pollution, deforestation, threats to wildlife. Air quality is degraded by vehicle emissions, industrial plants, construction, biomass burning, often linked to urban expansion and industry.
And water.
Water pollution comes mainly from industrial waste and untreated sewage discharge. Brunei's valuable hill forests are threatened by logging, agriculture, urban sprawl, and fires.
It sounds like the government is taking some steps to mitigate these environmental pressures and protect Brunei's natural heritage.
Yes. The government has largely halted large-scale commercial logging to conserve forest resources and restore key wildlife habitats. Collaborative efforts are underway between government and environmental organizations to establish a comprehensive protected forest reserve network. Plans are also developing for national parks featuring native animals, aiming to promote ecotourism.
What about endangered species?
Notably, endangered animals like orangutans and hornbills have full legal protection. The National Environmental Action Plan, NEAP, guides efforts, emphasizing monitoring, impact assessment, effective management, and robust regulation. However, there's a recognized need for a more comprehensive database for effective environmental monitoring and pollution control. The Sensitive Waters Project, under NEAP, specifically assesses coastal water quality.
Brunei's heavy reliance on oil and gas while bringing prosperity must also pose significant environmental risks.
Indeed. With the hydrocarbon sector accounting for about 90% of national revenue, the potential for environmental damage from oil spills and gas leaks is a severe, ever-present threat, especially given its limited coastline and the proximity of major facilities to the capital.
Right.
The projected lifespan of known oil and gas reserves further underscores the urgent need for meaningful economic diversification to lessen both economic and environmental vulnerabilities long-term.
But despite these challenges, Brunei is also recognized for its significant biodiversity, particularly its tropical rainforests.
Absolutely. Brunei is widely considered a jewel of tropical biodiversity conservation in Borneo. Over half its original forest cover remains unlogged, relatively intact. Digital modeling and surveys indicate generally good protection for vital ecosystems like wetlands, mangroves, coral reefs, but there are opportunities to enhance conservation for other forest types.
Any specific areas?
Specific grid cells have been identified harboring significant populations of restricted-range birds and mammals, indicating high conservation importance. While environmental awareness is growing, conservation planning in some critical areas is still in early stages. Fossil leaf florists suggest diptero, carp-dominated forests have been characteristic since the Pliocene, though overall plant diversity is somewhat lower than peninsular Malaysia.
The dominance of the oil and gas industry for over 70 years has clearly had a profound, multifaceted impact beyond just the economy.
It has been overwhelmingly dominant, monopolizing export earnings, national revenues, development planning, GDP for decades. This fostered a somewhat rigid oil-based development culture and significant long-term dependence on the energy sector.
Right.
While the government acknowledges the need for diversification and has implemented strategies, currently discovered fields primarily cater to the domestic urban sector. Other non-oil resources remain largely unexploited. Brunei generally maintains a pro-environmentalist public stance and pioneered initiatives like preserving mangrove swamps since the 1970s. Interestingly, while the 1960s Constitution included provisions for agricultural expansion for food security, the sector remains relatively small today.
Let's turn our attention to another increasingly important sector for Brunei's future: tourism. It seems to hold significant potential for diversification.
Yes, Brunei, with its lush, largely undisturbed rainforests, unique vibrant culture, and scenic South China Sea coastline, increasingly views tourism as strategically important for economic diversification. It's outlined in their National Vision 2035.
Right.
While often not on typical Southeast Asian itineraries, it's gained a reputation among discerning travelers for its pristine environment, especially rainforests, and its tranquil, relatively uncrowded atmosphere.
And it boasts some impressive landmarks and cultural attractions that could draw visitors.
Oh, absolutely. The Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin Mosque is iconic, architecturally magnificent, widely seen as one of the most beautiful in the Asia-Pacific. Other attractions include Jeradong Park, early 20th century royal palaces offering glimpses into history, and the Heritage Museum providing insights into culture, offering tours of traditional water villages like Kampong Air. Importantly, Bruneian society is generally quite protective of its carefully cultivated cultural norms, which adds to the unique character of the destination.
The tourism sector in Brunei seems to have its own unique characteristics and faces some specific challenges in its development.
Right. With relatively low tourist numbers compared to neighbors, Brunei offers a peaceful, authentic experience, largely free from mass tourism. However, this also means more substantial investment in preserving and developing tourist infrastructure is needed.
Like accommodation.
Yeah, the scarcity of budget options like hostels and infrequent public buses can challenge independent travelers. While package tours were historically dominant, some more expensive individual sightseeing options are emerging. Interestingly, car rental for tourists is generally not permitted, reportedly due to concerns about low petrol consumption by tourists in a nation with subsidized fuel. Despite these challenges, Brunei's rare natural scenery and the renowned courtesy and willingness of residents to welcome visitors are significant attractions. The intriguing juxtaposition of modern architecture, gleaming domes, grand mosques with preserved traditional culture water villages, Malay heritage provides a unique, exotic appeal. The Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin Mosque remains the most prominent landmark, one of Southeast Asia's largest, accommodating around 3,000 worshippers. Its stunning design, golden dome, breathtaking chandelier, particularly impressive. The miraculous nighttime view with its illuminated bridge is unforgettable. The Royal Palace, Istana Nurul Iman, completed in 1984, is another significant landmark, blending architectural styles. Its golden facade and dome are striking. It's open to the public during Hari Raya Aidilfitri. Experiencing the twice-yearly internal visits, if possible, is often suggested as truly memorable.
It sounds like there's a need for a more strategic, integrated approach to developing cultural tourism in Brunei.
Absolutely. An integrated concept, truly appreciating and leveraging Brunei's unique cultural resources for creative tourism initiatives is needed. Effective heritage management through greater community ownership and participation is crucial to prevent loss of local identity facing increasing tourism.
Right.
Current policy provisions for creative tourism seem limited, highlighting the need for comprehensive studies considering Brunei's specific local context and history. Financial limitations often pose a hurdle, particularly in less developed countries. In Brunei's case, slower tourism development has been partly attributed to inadequate budgets and somewhat bureaucratic processes. There have also been suggestions of a potential lack of specialized knowledge in tourism departments, possibly influenced by traditional cultural norms where respect for elders might sometimes inadvertently stifle innovation. Human potential in lower management might not always be fully utilized. However, there are recent signs of a more open approach, greater local input, like the development of a horse racing track by a royal family member. It's also important how broader government welfare spending priorities might impact tourism budgets, especially in oil-rich nations, where tourism might be a lower priority than social welfare, potentially affecting long-term sustainability.
Finally, let's delve into the crucial area of education and its role in Brunei's ongoing development as a modern nation.
Right. Education is universally seen as fundamental, a basic human need, a right for every child, critical for socioeconomic development. It breaks poverty cycles, shapes character and behavior. Brunei's formal education began with the first primary school in 1914 under British colonial administration. The British initially focused on primary education, particularly with religious instruction emphasis for the predominantly Islamic society, leading to many religious and secular primary schools. The Borneo Company significantly expanded primary provision in the mid-40s, increasing teacher recruitment and training, aiming to better prepare students for secondary school and improve vernacular instruction. Student enrollment grew significantly from about 755 in 1949 to around 95,000 by 1961, with diverse school types existing.
So what drove its later success?
Brunei's subsequent educational success is often attributed to rapid, systematic development of its administrative and educational infrastructure and a comprehensive national plan. Key policies included free and compulsory primary education, a mainstream provision system, a teacher training master plan, and formal decentralization into a three-tier system. Essential developments also included rapid construction of new schools and increased enrollment. Brunei has now effectively established a comprehensive school system, achieving near universal literacy, 100%, with ongoing efforts focused on enhancing quality.
What are the current priorities?
The current milestone is a well-established system at all levels. 5-year objectives include strongly emphasizing improving teaching and learning of maths and science through English, and continued investment in teacher professional development. New initiatives strengthen technical vocational education, foster ICT skills, expand distance education, and better prepare students for the wider world.
The current educational system in Brunei appears quite well established and comprehensive.
Yes. In 1959, Brunei became a British protectorate with a constitution supporting educational institutions. New policies were formulated with British help, emphasizing Malay. Brunei's first constitution in 1962 outlined the government framework, including education's crucial role. The Ministry of Education promoted a national system, aiming by 1979 to fully develop and use Malay across all levels. A 2017 revision to the education enactment gave more authority to ministry officers.
What's the structure now?
Currently, Brunei offers 12 years of free primary and secondary schooling, with potential extension plans. Primary education goals are pupils' readiness for formal schooling and Malay literacy. Malay is the primary instruction language, religious subjects in Arabic. Brunei incorporated Arabic script into Malay and developed Romanization in the 70s. Formal early day and final exams assess progress, and a new fast-track method accelerates learning for skilled students in maths, physics, or all three sciences.
And secondary and beyond.
Secondary education aims for broad fundamental knowledge, leading to the Brunei-Cambridge GCE O-level exams. Higher institutions offer pre-university diplomas for O-level graduates. Mandatory attendance is required for all Muslim students at schools managed by the Ministry of Religious Affairs for comprehensive religious education. Preschool provision is expanding, with standardization plans. Guidance centers support disabled students. Attempts are ongoing to formalize non-institutional religious education. Brunei has achieved a remarkably high literacy rate, over 96%, and higher education access has been available since 1999.
Looking towards the future, what are some key prospects and ongoing challenges for Brunei in education and overall national development?
Well, Brunei, as this small yet geographically significant nation, proud of its relatively pristine environment, faces the ongoing challenge of sustaining its progress. With its tropical rainforest climate, population concentrated coastally, it shares cultural values and roots with larger neighbors Sarawak and Sabah, while maintaining its distinct social system rooted in a Malay sultanate dating back centuries. Its history of relatively slow development and gradual political evolution led to a steady growth of unique local norms and traditions. Brunei gained full independence September 16, 1984, after 114 years under British influence, following a brief, unsuccessful merger with Malaya and withdrawal from Malaysia. Post-independence, it retained traditional structures headed by the Sultan. The Protector era saw reduced British functions. Since independence, Brunei has become an active member of the Commonwealth, ASEAN, OAC. Moving forward, its development likely depends on strategically investing in human capital through a robust, adaptable education system, successfully diversifying its economy beyond oil and gas, and carefully preserving its unique cultural and environmental heritage against increasing globalization.
So we've taken a deep dive, as promised, journeying from ancient settlements through the rise and fall of an empire, the complexities of colonialism and independence, and into the modern era of an oil-rich nation. It's truly remarkable to grasp the historical depth and multifaceted nature of this relatively small corner of the world.
It is. Brunei offers a compelling case study, how a nation navigates history, from early foundations to regional power, through transformative experiences of colonialism and the dramatic impact of natural resource wealth.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the delicate balancing act Brunei continues to perform between embracing modernization and steadfastly preserving its unique heritage and deeply rooted traditions in an increasingly interconnected, rapidly changing global landscape.
Indeed. And considering Brunei's distinct historical trajectory and its current unique position, it prompts a fundamental question for you, the listener. What do you believe are the most significant long-term challenges and opportunities that Brunei might encounter in this interconnected world? Perhaps further exploration into Brunei's rich culture, layered history, and contemporary affairs will offer some insightful perspectives.